welcome to Trinity Church podcast Bible in a Year reading plan, where we are walking through the Bible Project reading plan, one story that leads to Jesus. Today I have with me Julie Staub, who helped kick off the podcast in week one. Welcome, Julie. What do we get to jump into today for our podcast?
Well, today we're in Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 12. Hopefully everybody's getting caught up if they've been behind or they're right on target where they need to be, or maybe you're just jumping in at the beginning. It's all great wherever you are because you're getting into God's Word. Oh, my computer's going to sleep. So we are moving through Saturday to Saturday. If you're on our Facebook group, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Which is a change from where we were, because in the podcast we've been doing Monday to Monday.
Right.
But we're switching to Saturday to Saturday.
We're trying to get everybody on the same page. So, yeah. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, and part of that you'll notice because the Saturday post that goes out is actually Saturday to Saturday. So hopefully this will be help for everybody in terms of clarity as we go through this. So before we begin, Julie, let's get to know Julie a bit more. Your husband was in the military, so let's talk about different places you've lived. Where are some of the, besides you grew up in Sioux Falls, so let's not count Sioux Falls,
right.
the metroplex that Sioux Falls is.
It's huge.
But let's talk, where else have you had to travel for military and other purposes?
Well, first of all, I never thought I would ever leave Sioux Falls. I thought I'd live and die there. So I moved to Florida, and we moved to California.
What part of Florida?
We were in Pensacola to begin with for Chris's military training. So Pensacola, then we moved to Sacramento, California, which I loved because to me the temperature was perfect. It wasn't too humid and there were no bugs. Then we moved back to Florida to Sacramento. Not Sacramento,
Sounds a
that's
lot like
the wrong
Nebraska,
state.
Sacramento.
We moved to Jacksonville, and that was a temporary move, so we weren't there very long. And then we moved to Topsom, Maine. My husband was stationed in Brunswick, and that's where Samantha was born. So we had some excitement there. And then in 1991, we moved to Papillion, Nebraska, and we've been in the same house that whole time.
So several states. Mm-hmm. So what place besides Papillion, obviously, which is your favorite besides Papillion that you've been to?
I just mentioned it, Sacramento.
Sacramento?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Florida.
Pensacola was too hot?
I was pregnant in both places.
Oh,
it was hot. It was humid.
That's unfair then.
There were big flying bugs. It was just not
naturally
a happy place.
Uncomfortable already.
Yeah.
And you're going to blame it on Florida now.
And Maine had these little no-see-em bugs that were just terrible.
Too.
Terrible biting.
I hate when those come out. So, okay, next question. What's the best place you've ever been on vacation?
Well, this is kind of a silly question because Chris and I are not big travelers, but our favorite place was Galena, South Dakota. My in-laws moved out when we had moved to Nebraska. I don't think this was a reflection of us, but they moved to and retired to Galena, South Dakota. So we were expecting grandparents would be really close, and that wasn't the case. But it did make a great vacation spot. So I want to say 14 years.
It's in the Black Hills, right?
Yeah. Kind of about 8 miles from the Lead Deadwood T. I don't remember the name of the highway that went this way, but you could go to Lead or Deadwood. But I want to say 13, 14, 15 years in a row. That's where we went. They lived on an acre and a half, a great home that was right on the edge of a creek, and then a mountain beyond the creek. And so as the kids grew up, we got to leave them there for a couple weeks at a time. And yeah, it was a great place.
Awesome.
Four-wheelers, all the fun stuff. Final
question. You are getting near retirement age. What are you most excited about for retirement?
I am 39, Matt.
39. That's when you retire, isn't it? Like 40?
Well, they keep talking about early retirement, and that's when it should happen. So.
I think I would jump on the retirement piece.
It's crazy to think that I'm entering this phase of life. For those of you that are not there yet, it will get here soon. But Chris and I bought some land out by Shelton, Nebraska. So it's 2 hours straight west, and we bought 5 acres of land and a 1 acre pond, and we hope to retire and fish. So got to build a house first.
Well, let's go ahead and jump into our focus for today, which is Deuteronomy 1 through 12. I forgot to pick out our winner for Trinity Cafe, so maybe we will post that in the things, or maybe Nathan will find it, somebody on there that we can haven't given one to yet, and we'll let you know in the middle of the podcast. So,
and we love engagement. We love when people share their comments, what they're learning, what's a challenge, all of that.
Yeah.
You know, we're trying to grow community and build community, so share your thoughts and your input as we go along in this.
Yeah, anything that you find interesting or find as you don't understand, let us know in that chat. In either YouTube you can do it, or in Facebook. I think those are those the only two options? Okay, so those two options. So, and maybe win a Trinity Cafe drink. So let's jump in. And great job. We are through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And that means we start in Deuteronomy today, which Deuteronomy is essentially a collection of Moses' final speeches. It's like he's giving a sermon to this massive crowd of Israelites. And the Israelites have been wandering in the desert for 40 years, and then they're on the edge now of the promised land. And that's how Deuteronomy starts. And Moses knows he won't get to enter in with them, so he takes the opportunity to remind them of basically everything that they've learned, as well as the covenant that they then share through God.
Yeah, exactly. And throughout these speeches, Moses, he's really emphasizing obedience to God's laws. We could benefit from that today. So he doesn't want them to forget all that God's done for them from their time in Egypt, and then through their wandering throughout the wilderness. In some ways, it's like a dad who is really giving instruction to his children one last time before they're being sent off to live on their own and be on their own. And so these chapters are really a mix of history, laws, some personal reflection on poor choices that were made, and many of those personal moments with Moses.
Yeah. Well, let's talk Deuteronomy 1 through 12 then. It begins with Moses talking about an 11-day journey, and that's how he phrases it. It's this far to this far is 11 days, and now we are on day 40 years. Think about 11-day journey, but we're on day 40 years.
Yeah, yeah. I have moments like that in my own life where I think, oh, this is going to be quick, and then it doesn't. It's never been 40 years.
Never 40 years. I compare it to the old show Gilligan's Island, where a 3-day tour turned into a lifetime of seasons. For sure. So, but yeah, think of that 40 years of wandering, and like your feet, and just being without really a home and without a place that would be your own. Yeah. So it's hard to fathom. So my feet would be super sore. I don't like running without a purpose of a ball in the midst of it.
That's kind of crazy. Yeah. Your shoes didn't wear out. God provided all those things.
And they didn't even have shoes. They were probably sandal-y leather things. They could not have been comfortable.
So, well, Moses is then recounting those 40 years in the wilderness and of this wandering. They're really at the door to enter into the promised land. And it's a place where they had been 40 years earlier. And then Moses, he's got kind of a bitter heart in some ways, and I don't blame him at all for that, because he's pretty much saying to the people, the Lord was angry with you, and therefore I don't get to go. It's because of you that I don't get to cross into the promised land, this place they've all been hoping for.
He repeats it several times, where he's just like, he slides it into his sermon, like, and the Lord was angry at me because of all of you.
Remember.
Because you guys disobeyed. Now I don't get to enter the promised land. Did I tell you about the time I didn't get to enter the promised land? Maybe I should repeat that. Well, we end up seeing Moses summarizing in chapter 1 how these 40 years earlier that they were on the verge of the promised land. This is what chapter 1 really is all about, is him reflecting back to when they were in this exact same place 40 years earlier. And what was it that happened? Joshua, Caleb, and the spies that we had just read about in Numbers. And the other spies all give a bad report. Joshua and Caleb said, no, the Lord says take this land. And so the people rise up, though, and basically they are forced to wander for 40 years until that whole generation is passed away. And then it's their kids that get to enter. And so we're on the verge now of that 40 years being done. Moses is at the promised land entry. He's not going to get to go in, but he's saying, all of you who are about to enter, remember.
Yeah, remembering is really brought up a lot through this whole thing. So we're entering into chapter 2. Moses is recounting how that even in the wilderness, the people were cared for by God. I mentioned the shoes, the shoes that didn't wear out. And God knows all of their needs. He provides for them fully. He even defends them in battles that they encountered. And so the Lord gives everything into their hands.
Yeah, they have several battles in chapter 2 and into chapter 3. I want to highlight in chapter 3, though, verse 24, and it says, for what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such mighty acts? And that word God there is lowercase g, meaning that he's referring to other spiritual beings and false gods that have no power. And he's contrasting it then with the God who they worship. God is God, and these little g gods have no power in comparison to Yahweh, the God of Israel. And that's kind of a reflection point consistently throughout the Old Testament, but Moses highlights it pretty well here in this statement in 24.
Yeah, and even when I read through these chapters, it just is a reminder to me, like, what little g gods do I set my own heart on?
Yeah.
When God is calling for my whole heart, my whole mind, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. So we're entering into chapter 4 now. Moses commands obedience to the Lord. Listen and do. So it sounds a lot like the book of James.
Yeah.
Hopefully you're familiar with that, but if not, we'll get to that as we continue our journey through the Word. But there is a clear call against idol worship. And sometimes we don't really even like to think or ponder about that word, but as people, we tend to craft our own gods, our lower G gods. And even when you were talking about wandering those 40 years, I was reminded of how when Moses was gone for 40 days and the people wanted to make a calf out of gold to worship and to call the God that had brought them out of Egypt. It's just our minds and our hearts long for those things that are not of what God designs for us.
It's interesting in that as well, because it's easy to see that in the past and in other people's lives of them doing that. And so we can look and be like, huh, silly people. But like, we still do this today. Like, even if we say we worship Jesus, if we're crafting Jesus in our own image, Jesus is a little g God. This is not the Jesus of the New Testament. This is not the Jesus that we see and experience in the Bible. Then we're crafting an image that we want. And this is what we do. We craft gods in our own image to our likeness and how we desire God to be. And this is our consistent issue. And so to look back in the Old Testament and say, oh, silly people, but not to place that upon ourselves is really wrong and a disservice. But it is easier to see it in other people.
Absolutely.
We then get to verse 7. God speaks about his nearness to us. And this is a beautiful verse in verse 7 where God is talking about being near to the people, that he is different than these other gods who are far distant, false gods, but he wants to be with his people. And it draws in this beautiful imagery from Christmas of Emmanuel, God with us, where Jesus literally comes down to be with us.
Yeah. It's pretty powerful. Like, it's talking about all these other nations, and they're all striving. They strive to be with this God, but we've got this God that loves us so much, he comes to be with us. So hopefully everybody's planning to be at Easter when we get to really celebrate. So verse 24 is a reminder. Lord God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. That's really intense, if you ask me. But there's some wow factors in that. It's a reference to people creating carved images, like we just mentioned a minute ago. Idolatry, where really our hearts just want to serve those lower G gods. And so what do we do with that idea that God is a jealous God? Like, he longs for relationship with us that's just centered on who he is.
And I know that language troubles people at times. Like, that word that God is jealous really is almost a detriment for people at times, because they're like, oh, how can God be jealous? Isn't he then sinning? And the difference is that God has the ability to be jealous because he is the only one worthy to be praised. And that's the context that we have to sit in, is that God's jealousy is a jealousy because he is the only one worthy of praise, and you are worshiping lower created things. And so God's jealousy, it uses that language, consuming fire. Lord God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. And that shouldn't trouble us, but I know that's a hang-up word for people at times, that God would be jealous. So,
yeah, I've never, like, in my lifetime, I've never really experienced that in the relationships that I've had, at least that I've been aware of. But I don't know what, like, the original Greek and Hebrew for jealous is, or what those defining definitions really are. But if we can think of that as, like, if God's jealous for you, sometimes don't we want people to be jealous of us, which then brings in pride, which is not good. But like, to me, that means, wow, God really wants me to have this relationship with him.
His desire for us. And then verse 31, this is a beautiful verse, and it fits with some of the stuff we've been talking about on Sundays when Pastor Mike's been talking about God has a name. 31 says, the Lord is a merciful God and will not leave you, nor will he forget his covenant with his people. What a great reminder. And this is kind of a consistent theme, though, that gets brought up, is the Lord will not forget his covenant with you. You, stubborn people, keep doing the thing you do, but God is faithful, and he will not forget his covenant. But he's also merciful, and he will not leave you or forget you. So then we get to the chapter 5. And chapter 5 is the Ten Commandments. And so it gets repeated. Moses is referring back to receiving the Ten Commandments. And so I don't know what we talk about specifically with the Ten Commandments, because we kind of hit on it. But what's your favorite Ten Commandment? Oh, actually, let's go with this one. Which Ten Commandment have you most recently broke?
Oh, wait. I thought we were going to talk which one. My favorite is children obey your parents.
Oh, yeah. That is a favorite, yeah.
Yeah. I asked Matt earlier today, like, you know, as we're called to remember God, and we're going to get into that in a little bit, but do we really ever bring this up just in conversation?
Yeah. Which is what we're
hold
about
each other
to step
accountable
into,
to it even.
Though, in terms of that this is supposed to be brought up and in conversation all the time. And it's actually what we do in our baptismal promises as well, is teach your kids the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
Teach them the Lord's Prayer. Teach them the Creed. Teach them all these different things.
Bring them to worship.
Yeah. So we're going to jump then to chapter 6. So we're not completely moving past the Ten Commandments. We kind of hit on it several weeks ago when we first encountered the Ten Commandments. But chapter 6 has quite a bit in it. And gets referred to in a lot of other places as well. So it begins with chapter 6, verse 4, where we see the Lord is God, the Lord is one. And this is known as the Shema. I always say things wrong, so it could
I had
be
not
Shema,
heard this
Shema.
word before, so
yeah.
Go for it, Matt.
I'll mispronounce every word, because that's what I do. But this is actually referred to constantly and is said by the people over and over again in Jewish culture. So this is something that is repeated just almost in greeting almost. The Lord is God, the Lord is one. But there's an interesting thing as we continue in chapter 6. It's followed by then the Great Commandment. And what is the Great Commandment?
Yeah. And so the Great Commandment is found in verse 5. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and might. And I just find that interesting. I'm going to just have a little bit of confession here. There's a television show that I would spend my time binge watching, and God really spoke to me to say, Julie, this is not a show that is good for you to watch. And so I stopped it cold turkey. And I don't know that we sit and reflect on, like, okay, how am I doing in loving God with all of my heart? How am I doing in loving God with all of my soul? How am I doing in with loving God with all of my might? You know, and I think if we spent time reflecting on that every day, it might change some of the things that we're experiencing and walking through.
Yep. Which is followed then by verse 6, which says, these words should be on your heart. Teach them to your children, talk about them all the time, write them on the doorposts and gates, and when you enter the land, don't forget. And this is also where they have, it says in the midst of that, I didn't read the whole thing, it says that you would put them as frontlets on your forehead.
We were going to put little bricks
boxes.
on our, little boxes here and glue them on our heads.
So, and what that's referring to is that they would literally have a cube that they would have on their head, and in the cube would be verses that they would have as memory verses, in essence, written inside of it. And it's something actually that Jesus calls out in the New Testament as saying that you are all about the show, that you make your frontlets extra large. And it's like Jesus is calling this out of like, this is not what I want. This is not what I mean when I say to put this on your forehead, that it should be written in you, that it should be written on your heart and your mind, that you should know these things, and that means that you're actually living them too, not just the knowledge of, not just the listen, but the do part that we talked about before. And that's where he then says, talk about these with your children as well. Talk about them in public, in all of the spaces that you encounter and enter. Talk about it.
Yeah. And I just want to offer some encouragement to parents right now, because for those of you that I know a lot spend a ton of time in their cars going to dance and piano and gymnastics and all sorts of sporting events, and you might feel like you're talking about them all the time, and your kids might be rolling their eyes at you. But I just want to give you confidence to know that you're doing what God is calling you to as their parent. So when you tuck them in at night, when you're having breakfast in the morning, when you're wandering at the zoo, wherever you're at, just bring up God and who he is, because it's planting those seeds in your child's life and in your child's heart. And in the end, it's what God is calling you to do as their parent.
So for my drives, which is not super far from my house to the school,
my drive's
or
3 minutes.
from there to daycare, Micaiah and Benaiah, my two youngest, like to play a game of how many questions can I ask Dad in 4 miles? And I bet it's at least 80. They have so many questions, so it's like I don't get a word in. so for me to talk about things like that right now is like, Micaiah just keeps asking question upon question.
Give them the theme for what their questions need to be. So today we're talking about the Psalms.
Benaiah likes to talk
Shoot
about weather as a 4-year-old, which seems really strange, but
well, God calms the storm.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're up to chapter 7, and
kind of 7 through 9, because this is kind of similar. Yeah.
Okay.
Take care lest you forget. So he just said don't forget. Now he says take care lest you forget, and remember the Lord your God.
Yeah. Remembering him.
Yeah. So it's kind of like a warning against taking God's blessings for granted. So once they're living in the land, so Moses is saying, once you enter this land, don't take God's blessings for granted, because what's going to happen is you're going to become self-sufficient, and you're going to forget that what got you here in the first place. Because when you start to actually settle and dwell in the land, and you meet with success, and things like start to happen on their own, and you don't feel like God has to be very present and rescue you all the time, you get into this habit of forgetting God.
Yeah. And you start taking ownership of things you don't really own. You know, we have, because God's blessed us and given us things. So yeah, absolutely. Moses goes on to remind them that their success is not because of their own righteousness, but because of God's faithfulness. And it's sometimes a humbling reminder that these blessings are really a gift for us.
And chapter 9 talks about this idea of it's not your own righteousness, which is interesting because so often we think of the New Testament talks about Jesus' righteousness and that we get Jesus' righteousness, but everything in the Old Testament we think about, well, the law is always pointing us to our own righteousness, that we have to do. The better we are, the better people we are, is what we always think that through the lens of. But in chapter 9, it says, it's not because of your righteousness as a people. Instead, I'm giving you this land because of the wickedness of all these nations. You are going to be allowed to drive them out. But it is nothing to do with who you are. It's actually my covenant with you, that I've just simply decided to love you and choose you.
Yeah, I found that kind of striking when I read that. It's because of the chaos of these other nations that God is making a way for his people to go in, but it has nothing to do with their own righteousness. And then he goes on to say, you're a stubborn people. Like, you're stubborn people. Who wants to be told that?
Yeah.
Most of us would prefer the pat on the back and you're great.
Rebellion.
But, yeah. So we've been rebellious, yet the Lord's covenant with us remains. And that's because of his faithful love. Pastor Mike talked about that this last Sunday. Yeah. Just his love is so faithful to us despite our wickedness, our wretchedness, our disobedience.
Yeah.
So in chapter 10, we get to this phrase. It's kind of interesting language, circumcise your heart. So what does that mean?
Yeah, it's because so obviously circumcision is a thing now with Abraham, part of the covenant. But then in the New Testament, we see this word thrown in constantly. And a lot of people, when they read the New Testament, are like, what is the deal with circumcision? Because it talks about it so frequently. But here, what it's talking about is the idea of that our hearts are actually very much love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That when it's saying circumcise your heart, that your heart is in covenant with the Lord. So it goes into then some verses in chapter 10 about this. So chapter 10, verse 12 says, and now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Which is interesting language because that's the same entry point for Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? And in that one, it's a little different, but this one says, but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. And then it says, circumcise, this is verse 16, circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stubborn.
So that's the part that get rid of that stubbornness, and apparently that equates to foreskin.
Yeah, circumcising your hearts. So, and then he goes in verse 21. This was a really beautiful verse, and it's really a great summary of where the Lord has brought his people. And it says in verse 21, he is your praise, he is your God, who has done for you these great and terrifying things that your eyes have seen. And now just take a moment and think through, like, even if you're at home, just close your eyes for a moment and think through all of these things that this group of people has been through since entering Egypt, back in Joseph's time. When Joseph entered Egypt on his own as a slave, and now he's saying, who has done for you these great and terrifying things that your eyes have seen? Splitting of the Red Sea, the plagues, the bringing the people through the wilderness, providing manna, providing water. And then in verse 22, your father went down to Egypt, 70 people in total, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven. And we're talking tons and tons of people. They've done these censuses, and now we've got tons and tons of people, and it started with 70 when we started this. Yeah.
Well, and it's crazy to me, when they left Egypt, there were like 600,000 of them. And so there's been 40 years since then. And so those 600,000 people, a lot of multiplication that happens there. And I can't even comprehend, how did they deal with sanitation and water just all those kinds of things. But
That's a good research paper, Julie.
I'm going to retire, Matt.
What? No, I think this is your next thing. Researching the sanitation and things from the Israelites.
They had to have a
in the
lot of
wilderness.
shovels. That's all I can think. And they were wandering. You know, it's not like they were building a city and hunkering down so they could figure those
Maybe
things
that's
out.
why they wandered.
Yeah, whoops, smelly air.
Got to
Let's
keep
move
ahead
on.
of this. Chapter 11 is really a repetition of chapter 6. Like, it repeats a lot of it. It starts with, "You shall therefore lay up these words of mine in your hearts, in your soul, and bind them as a sign on your hand, frontlets between your eyes," which we talked about. "You shall teach them to your children, talking about them wherever you're sitting in your house." And then it ends it, though, with a clear verse 23 is how I'll end it here, is in chapter 11, verse 23. "Then the Lord will drive out all these nations before you, and you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you." So this is what the Lord is going before them, is kind of what he's saying. And he's talking, and we're going to see this in the last chapter. He's driving out what he's referring to as nations that are doing evil and that have evil ways. And so this is the context that he's saying is, if you follow and teach your children, if you store up these words of mine and have them as who you are, then I will go before you.
Yeah, that verse right before it, 22, you know, "If you'll be careful to do all the commandments that I command you, loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and holding fast to him." And I liken that with story. I don't think we realize the power of our own personal stories in our walk with Christ, what he's done for us, and the power of story in helping people to remember who God truly is. Like, he is the God of glory, the God of might, the God of love, and the God of grace, the God of mercy and justice. So, and then we swing into chapter 12, which is a warning against idolatry. So he's just telling us, do not be drawn to false idols, those false idols of the other nations. So they're being moved into this territory where there have been other nations that include all of these pagan rituals and practices. Some of them are pretty nasty, and you know, we can't wrap our minds around some of the things that they had done, but it's a reminder to us to guard our hearts just as we're living day to day in our life today, let alone what they faced back in that time. And
it quite literally is saying what is about to be the problem over and over again for your people, Moses. And Moses is saying what God's warning to us is as we go into this land, we are going to be drawn to the culture and customs of these people that are around us, and we will fall prey to their false gods and to their evil cultures and custom issues that they have. One of which he talks about very specifically at the end of chapter 12, verse 23, where it says, "Then the Lord will drive out all these nations before you and will dispossess them." Oh, that's not the right one. Where did it go? I posted the wrong one. That's why. But it talked about in chapter 12, the part of what the issue that God had was that they were actually burning their children as sacrifices to their false gods. And he's like, Moses is warned by God that this is what your people will begin to do, because they will inevitably take on the culture around them and become a part of it. And this was a warning. So hold fast to what I say. Hold fast to my teaching. There's a warning against this very idolatry. Don't follow their ways and their false gods.
My mom had a saying when I was a teenager, and it always irritated me every time she said it, and that was, "You are who you run with." And so when you're immersed in this culture that isn't in alignment with who God is calling us to be, and what they were dealing with back in the pages of Deuteronomy, that really came to be. And so God really calls us to give our hearts to him, to love him, to follow him, to obey him, so that we don't fall prey to what's going on around us.
Yeah.
So I want to wrap up with verse 32.
Yep.
"Everything that I command you, you shall be careful to do it. You shall not add to it or take away from it." And so just a reminder that being in the Word, what we're doing here as a congregation this year, hopefully those of you who maybe have a different church home, you're getting in the Word every single day, to let this truth really penetrate into your heart, because as it does, we really will start living, we'll be circumcising our hearts, and we'll start living in a way that really puts God on display. And that's really the hope for all of us, is being in that good relationship.
Let us know if you have questions, any thoughts towards what you're reading in chapters 1 through 12. We'd love to hear from you. Do we have a winner? Did you find somebody? Okay, we'll post it in the comments, and I'll let the cafe know as well. Maybe we'll write your name out there so that we can get yours to you. Otherwise, we'll talk about it next week and let you know that you won. So, but thanks for joining us. Keep with it. We want to just encourage you to keep reading. And if you get behind, that's okay. Join us where we're at and keep going forward, and stay with it. So
celebrate. Whatever you've read, celebrate.
Yeah. Thanks for joining me, Julie.
Don't weigh it down on yourself. Celebrate. You've been in God's Word.
Yeah. God bless. We'll see you next time.